know what type of learning methods are most effective for us.
The learning style is a really common thing. It's a really popular need. Like, I'm a visual learner, I'm an auditory learner, I'm kinesthetic learner, or what have you. The research behind it is so bad. Like, it's not true. Like, pretty much all these kind of like horoscope personality learning distinction things, most of them don't hold water.
Scott H. Young
is an author, programmer, and an entrepreneur.
And he specializes in how to learn things really quickly.
What is the best method to learn? You want to have good examples. You want to get sort of honed in on the right method. You want to have lots of practice. You want to have feedback. But I would say like the major takeaway is that...
All right, Scott, thanks for coming back on the show. Round 2, baby. Let's go.
Yeah. I'm so excited.
Yeah, so we had a good conversation last time all around skill acquisition. We're going to go deeper, obviously. You got your first book, which was Ultra Learning that we talked about. And then now you got this new book, Get Better at Anything. I guess for one, what was the parts that you felt was missing in the first book, Ultra Learning, that you felt this new book, Get Better at Anything, was a kind of a missing piece that you're trying to fill with this new book?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, like, learning has been the topic that I've been obsessed with for, I've been writing about it for 2 decades. So in some ways I could write like 7 of these books. I don't know whether people would want to read 7 of these books, but I have like more, there's always more stuff that I could talk about. So in some ways it's that, but part of it is also that when I wrote the first book, I took a very particular kind of perspective. Like, I had done these sort of intensive learning projects. I knew this sort of kind of offbeat community of people who had done these intensive learning projects. People speak a dozen languages and people who are, mastering weird skills. And so the book was kind of shining a spotlight on individuals who are undertaking aggressive, intense, weird learning projects and then trying to extrapolate out from there. But that framing itself sort of sets yourself up to talk about some things, but not about other things. And so I think how I got into this book was actually a really interesting story. So the YouTuber John Green was talking about Tetris players, and I just thought this was fascinating, that Tetris has been around for a long time. The original Tetris players who were, starting in the early 90s, late 80s were, like any obsessed with this game, and there was lots of people playing it, but they're nowhere near as good as the 13-year-old kids are today. And I thought that was really interesting because it wasn't about, here's just some remarkable individual and how he or she did X, but about how the environment really can constrain or enhance our growth, and what that environment says about what are the necessary ingredients for learning. So this book ended up being a book where I wanted to figure out what those ingredients were, not just like, here's some weird subculture, some phenomenon, but really focus on like, what are the fundamental ingredients that underpin learning, and how does that apply, universally, like throughout space and time to all situations. And so I spent a lot more time going into the basic scientific research, trying to really get a picture of, what are the things you need to do if you want to get better at anything, to reuse the title.
Dude, you give us a cliffhanger there. What was it about Tetris players that allowed them to thrive? What were these 13-year-old kids doing that made them masters of this game?
Yeah. So the basic idea is that to be really good at Tetris, it's not enough to play a lot. You have to use the right techniques. And it seems like a simple game, but there's quite a bit of strategy, quite a bit of thinking involved. And the issue is that you can definitely get better by practicing, and you'll learn some of these things just through observation on your own. But it's a lot easier to learn it if someone tells you what the right thing to do is. And the issue is that in the early 90s, essentially players were disconnected. Maybe you would read something in like a Nintendo Power magazine, or your friend's older brother would be like, oh yeah, you could do this trick to move this block into this place that maybe you don't know about. But for the most part, that knowledge wasn't widely shared, widely connected. And so you have examples of players from like this early era who do figure out a useful technique, but it's not widely adopted because no one has the ability to really learn from them. And then you fast forward to today, we have live streaming, we have forums, we have people with videos in their hands, we have people who do like these detailed analyses of like, this is how the code works in the game, and so you need to do X, Y, or Z. It's so much easier to get up to the best methods. And so this illustrates a very basic principle of learning, which is that most of what we know comes from other people, and the ease of learning from other people, or the obstacles to doing that, is a major bottleneck or accelerant of our growth. And so you can see this in many, many fields. So one of the things that I thought was a very interesting connection is basically the same process underlied the transformation of chemical science from alchemy, which, you know, we now kind of think of as being sort of pseudo-mystical and not being like a real science at all, into chemistry, which is what we have today. The difference wasn't that the people who were alchemists didn't care about getting things right, or they were, you know, like mystical, or they didn't believe in like a theory of matter. No, the difference was that those people in that period of time believed in communicating things in this super secretive way, so that when they would write their books about alchemy, they would skip steps and they would draw elaborate diagrams that were, you know, fantastical and didn't really represent what they were doing, because of this cultural belief that alchemy was supposed to be this knowledge that should be only shared among like select few. It shouldn't be shared very widely. And so you have, as a result, people weren't able to build reliable knowledge. Whereas, you know, some of the first chemists, Robert Boyle, he draws like very detailed diagrams. He puts the actual measurements he made. That ability to learn from other people. This is the experiment they're doing. This is the results they're getting. That was what allowed it to turn into a science. And so you can see this in many, many situations across time, but the ability to learn from other people, I mean, it's not just about Tetris or chemistry. It's your ability to succeed at your job, your ability to do all these things really depends on it.
Fascinating. So this goes beyond this idea of like, what was it? Good artist, copy, great artist, steal.
Copy,
and
great artist, steal, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if it's reversed or not, but the whole idea that you can, the whole idea you can take ideas from concepts from artists and you can form that into your own and become a master at that. And you're saying that can apply to fields like learning new things, new games, new skills, and you can apply that to kind of being able to learn anything really from that.
Yeah. I mean, that's a central point, I think, is that when we're wanting to learn a skill, we want to start from a base of good examples, figure out how other people solve the problems in the domain that we're struggling with, be able to look from those examples. I think sometimes in our culture, there's a bit of resistance to that. You know, you bring up the artist example, but I know like the art class I took in high school, the emphasis was very much on like, let the kids do their own projects and find their own voice. And there wasn't a lot of teaching. There wasn't a lot of like, this is how you draw things accurately. This is why this painting looks good and this one doesn't look good. And so it was very interesting. I devote a chapter talking about the instruction during the Renaissance, and it also applies to the period, the academy system that followed it. But there was a real emphasis on the old days of, you know, you would be in the master's workshop, you would see how they would paint things and they would get you to copy stuff. That was how you learned those techniques. And as you got better, you started to, you know, use your own methods, your own original, your own creativity, but it was built off of this really good foundation of technique and craft. And that's sometimes what's missing in a lot of creative fields, is that we encourage people to skip over the craft stage and just get right to the creative stage. Skip over like learning the technique, learning the right way of doing things, and just be like, you know what, you need to find your own way of doing it. Well, yeah, but that's also a way that you can be stunted in your development because you don't actually know good ways and you have to invent them from scratch.
Dude, this is a little bit random, but I think about StarCraft, the game. Are you familiar with StarCraft? Like the whole Blizzard?
Passingly. Yeah.
Passingly, right? Okay, so that was a huge game in Korea. And I always think about like, why is it that all of the best players are in Korea? And same with Counter-Strike and all these different things. And this makes me think about what you're saying, which is before Twitch, before live streaming, esports, and all of these different things, Koreans used to like display people playing StarCraft on TV. And it was a huge thing where there were celebrity e-gamers before Twitch was a thing and before esport celebrities were a thing. And players used to also now watch other people that were at the top of their game play and improve. I would imagine that there has to be some factor to that around just being able to watch other people growing up. I know StarCraft is like the most random example, but it just kind of made me think about that.
But it's not though. I think like I use the example of Tetris because I think when you're talking about, especially when you're talking about video games, Tetris is like one of those ones that sits enough in the popular culture that like people don't, but I could have done any game. Like literally this change occurred to all games. Like I could pick games that I played when I was a kid that you're like not very good at, and then you now see people like glitching it out and they're like beating it in like 8 seconds kind of thing. It was a transformation for that, and I think it's the same is true for like competitive esports and things like that as well. You know, I don't know. I feel like in some ways the cross-cultural differences in teaching and education are also relevant here as well, because you know, a lot of East Asian cultures with the influence from Confucianism had this real history of like copying from exemplars and like learning from the past, and that was a stronger pedagogical model. And you know, sometimes you'll hear pundits in the West. I remember hearing Malcolm Gladwell kind of like criticizing China for like, oh, they're not doing any creativity. But I think that just kind of has it backwards. That's not how creativity works. The creativity doesn't work by like, oh, well, we in the West teach our kids to be creative, and those people in East Asia teach their kids just to copy and do drills. I mean, you can copy without understanding. You can be in an environment that doesn't praise innovation, but creativity comes from copying. And so I think, you know, a lot of those predictions about, you know, East Asian cultures not being able to innovate are looking rather foolish now, because you have so many creative exports from those industries. And I think that a lot of the growth in the economy was based on this, again, this long-standing cultural tradition of using copying from exemplars and this sort of building the foundation. I feel like that tradition was not lost, although some places in the West that's kind of denigrated now.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's, you know, this whole idea of like there isn't really an original idea out there? And I think about people that were innovators, and a lot of them maybe they didn't copy from competitors, but they took ideas or inspiration from other industries that they brought into their own industry and allowed them to kind of borrow the ideas from something that were maybe have worked somewhere else, but now it's new, it's original because it's an industry that wasn't applied before. So it's kind of what you're implying as well.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two kinds of problems you can face, right? There's the problems which someone else somewhere in the world knows how to solve them. And then there's problems that, you know, no one's ever solved that problem before. And so I don't deny that there's problems of creativity where you have to make something genuinely new, but they tend to be from like standing on the shoulder of like, well, these are all the problems you already know how to solve. So if you're launching a business and you're going to do a new product, you know, maybe parts of the product are going to be this genuinely new problem-solving process. You're making something totally original. But I don't want my accountant using like creative accounting measures. I probably want to copy, this is how you do like a term sheet for an investor. Like 99% of it is going to be copied from somewhere else. And then there's that 1% of creativity that we're like, oh, so-and-so's a genius and we're clapping our hands. And so I think when we're looking at getting better at things and skills, that just extremely large mass of knowledge that is essentially copied from what other people have already figured out, that's almost all of it. And then our innovation is just this little thing that we put on top of it. And so I think if we don't see that as being the real picture, if we think that like, if we fancy ourselves as being like, oh, well, I've just made this from scratch and I didn't copy anyone, I think that just ignores how human thinking works. I mean, sometimes you can fall into that trap because you just take for granted all the things that you know. And so all the things that you just like, well, you did actually learn it from someone else, but you just take it as obvious. So I do think sometimes people who are successful creatives can do that. Like they're so focused on that 1% of originality that they really ignore the 99% of things that they just, I take for granted. Well, of course, everyone knows that, right? Yeah. I mean, that's super important. But if you don't have that 99%, if you only have 50% of it, I mean, you're never going to get there. You're never going to get up to that, you know, last little bit of creativity. You need to make a real contribution to things.
Yeah. And this is kind of more on the point of entrepreneurship, but it makes me think about how we often overestimate how much people actually want change. Like, remember when Facebook went to their normal post and they went to the timeline, and how much people freaked out because it was just displaying things in order instead. And now no one even looks at their timeline, but that's just the way it is, right? Yes. People don't often want crazy amounts of change, and it's like small little tweaks. Like even Bumble, like, oh, let's just do exactly what Tinder's doing, but make the women go first. And it's like a huge level of success. But if you go way too off beyond something that people are not really used to, then yeah, people generally don't want crazy amounts of change anyways. Nothing to do with learning but yeah.
No, but I think it's relevant. Like I have a quote from the social psychologist, the late social psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He's also more famous for the work he did on flow, but he also had an academic career where he was studying creativity, and he kind of proposed this model that like what creativity is and what creativity can be understood can't be understood just like purely from like an intellectual level. Like that this is like you could get people to a lab and you could understand what creativity is, because creativity has to be like someone has to think it's creative, right? And so he has this argument that like it's not just about this intellectual matter of knowledge, it's also about the receptive audience. So if I think something's really creative or I think something is just nonsense, that's coming from me. And his argument was that he has a quote. I'm not gonna be able to get it exactly right. I'm going to be paraphrasing here, but he has a quote where he says something like, we tend to view the limitations on creativity as being from the supply side, meaning that there's not enough geniuses, there's not enough good ideas. But he thinks it's on the demand side, that we like as a society can't change our way of thinking fast enough to accommodate these new ideas, that like the new ideas are out there. We're just not always able to accept them. So your Facebook example, I think, is a good one of that like we could experience a lot more change, but we're somewhat, conservative, and we like things that are familiar. I mean, you look at the movie industry, like how many reboots and remakes there are, is a little bit of a testament to like, we prefer familiarity with a lot of our works.
Yeah, totally. I think Peter Thiel said by, something around like a decade ago, we were promised hover cars or flying cars. Instead, we got 140 characters. This is like in 2010 when Twitter came out.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you're right. It's like maybe we just weren't ready for hover cars or flying cars in 2010.
Yeah.
But
well, I mean, just there's lots of innovations that I think, they don't succeed not just because of the technical limitations, but also because the surrounding environment needs to be ready for them. That's a whole other discussion. But yeah, I think it's important.
Yeah. So what are you learning these days? What are skills that you're trying to develop? And I'm curious to know, applying this technique around learning from other people and taking and stealing ideas or learning models from other people, how you're applying that strategy that you've written in your book in your current learning acquisition.
Yeah, I mean, I think, lots of ways. There's lots of projects that I have kind of on the horizon. I mean, right now with the promotion of the book, with the 2 kids at home, I'm not currently engaged in also another really intensive project. But as I'm working on things, as I'm seeing things coming up, you just can't help but like apply some of these ideas and start like, oh, you see the parallels to what you're doing. So, I mean, for my professional life, I think one of the things that I'm always having to do is like, I've been writing online for almost 20 years, and the internet has gone through like multiple revolutions. And so you get in this situation where you just keep doing what you're doing and you get comfortable, and then you turn around and you're like, look at all these kids who are like, becoming super famous doing this thing that I was very dismissive of, or I wasn't understanding. And so like the content is changing and stuff. And so I feel like there's going to be necessarily like kind of a dipping back into figuring out, okay, where do we want to succeed? Do we want to be, building up our newsletter? And now there's all sorts of stuff around like Substack and things like that. They're there. Do we want to be building a YouTube channel? In which case, you can see people are doing things in different ways. So I'm definitely going to be applying those principles in my professional life. Personally, hobbies, I also see the same thing. Like one of the things that I think definitely helped me like de-stress in moments when I was working on this book was I really enjoy painting. But painting is exactly this kind of thing where it's really satisfying when you do something well. And it's very frustrating when you're like, well, that didn't turn out, or that looks ugly. And so I think the same kind of process of like, how can you, a lot of the ideas of the book, like how can I reduce the cognitive load? How can I learn from examples? When should I be copying? When should I be practicing my own things? These are all questions that I feel like get reflected on that. So I've given some thought to like, maybe I'm going to do a project where I'll like go through each of the maxims and apply it to this hobby of mine, and or maybe something else that I'm working on.
Yeah, let's take an example. So for me, I'm learning Portuguese right now in Brazil, obviously, and I'm trying to apply some of the things as I was taking notes from your book and kind of the conversations that we had around like how I would be able to massively shortcut being. I mean, I did the first job, the hardest part, which is being immersed in Brazil. Most people are, in different parts around the world that they don't have access to actually being able to speak with native speakers. So I feel like I'm ahead there. But there's a lot of people learning languages or learning any skills. Let's just take this example as a framework. What would you recommend applying the rules that, whether it's ultra learning or get better in anything, that would just be able to massively shortcut?
Well, I mean, language learning, I have a lot of like specific experiences. So my usual starting point, because people will ask me about that, my usual starting point is, well, like, how much are you using Portuguese in your daily life? And I'm asking you this not to like be in a judgmental way, but there is people who you go to a country and they're like, I'm only speaking Portuguese day and night. Like outside of this conversation, I'm only Portuguese. But it's very easy also to be like, no, I only speak in English, and like, I'll say, obrigado, and that's about it, right? So you have to like, what is your sort of background life looking like? Like, how much are you using Portuguese? How much are you speaking it in your day-to-day life?
So I take lessons, private lessons, 2 to 3 times a week for 30 minutes. And then I do volleyball 3 to 4 times, which is mostly in Portuguese. And then I would go on dates, maybe. Well, I don't want to share how many dates I'm going on here, but occasionally. I forgot this is recorded. But
no. So what do you do on these dates, Sean? No, I'm just joking. But I mean, so my first advice usually when, and this was sort of the basis of the language learning experiment that I did about 10 years ago. One of the places we went was Brazil. What was to try to create an environment where you're only speaking in Portuguese to the greatest extent possible. Because a major difficulty when you're traveling is that if your level is not like super high, so you're not already fluent, it's just very natural to want to like, okay, I can speak in English. There's definitely some Brazilians that speak English. There's expats that live there. You're going to be meeting people. It's very easy to create an environment where you're actually only speaking Portuguese maybe like 10% of the time. So that's usually like the first thing to fix. Like if you're speaking Portuguese like 80 to 90% of the time because, okay, guys, I'm doing a project right now. I'm only going to speak in Portuguese. You will get over that. And that has some other consequences that are beneficial as well. So one of the chapters of the book, I talk about anxiety and, speaking a language that you don't speak very well is anxiety inducing. It's a little bit like, oh, I'm not very good at this. I feel like I lack confidence. And so one of the things that you can do to improve on that is if you have exposure, if you're sort of in situations where you're speaking more and more frequently, you don't make a decision about it. You're speaking in Portuguese. It will feel comfortable much faster than you'll feel like you're good. So that was the experience that Dat and I had when we were doing this language learning experiment, where when we landed in the country, we were only going to speak in Brazil in Portuguese or in Spain in Spanish and this kind of thing. And over a period of about like a month, it became very, very comfortable to only be speaking in that language. But it's not like we were super good. It's not like we had reached like this apex of proficiency. It was just that the sheer exposure of doing it all the time had reduced it. So that's usually my starting point, is like, how can you increase the quantity of practice that you're doing? And then of course, I think there's other things that help as well, like flashcards, like you mentioned, getting a tutor. I mean, with the Romance languages, conjugation and grammar can also be an issue too. Like there's quite a bit to memorize there. And so doing those kind of specific drills can help. But just getting enough exposure so that you're speaking regularly makes a big difference, because fluency is so important with a language, and fluency is mainly derived from just doing something a lot.
Yeah. So if your goal is to speak, it's kind of, suffice to say, is that you just got to speak, right? You just got to actually put yourself out there and practice. It's not necessarily just about memorizing words. Is that you're saying, is that the key thing, is just you have to put yourself in a place where you're not going to speak English. You're only going to think and try to speak in Portuguese, Spanish, whatever language you're learning.
Yeah, I mean, the thinking in the language, I think, comes naturally. I find it very hard to police one's own thoughts. So, I mean, if you are regularly speaking in a language, I think our internal monologue often reflects the speech that we're uttering a lot. So if you're speaking all the time in Spanish, it's just natural that more of your thoughts are going to be in Spanish or in Portuguese or what have you. But I think the main thing is that, it's the conversation. So it's not just speaking. Like if I just, okay, I'm just going to like monologue to the camera in Portuguese, I don't know whether you'd make that much improvement. It would be more you'd be more fluent, you'd be more comfortable pronouncing things. But it's the interaction with people, right? Because when you're speaking to someone, you're also listening to them. And so you're hearing phrases, you're hearing expressions, and they understand things or don't understand things. So you're getting feedback. So you're getting a corrective kind of, even if they don't correct you, even if there's never saying like, oh, you're saying this wrong, you'll notice that, oh, I'm not saying it the way they're saying it. Or you notice these things and you'll start to pick it up. So I think the major barrier with learning a new language, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why people often say that young people learn languages so much faster than adults, which is another interesting set of research we can get into if you like. But the reason people say that is because young children, you throw them off at the daycare and the kids don't speak English, so they have to speak that language. And they're getting like 8-10 hours of practice a day, whereas we as adults who have jobs and other lives and things that we're doing are speaking English most of the time. And then you're lucky if you get a half an hour tutoring session, and then you're like, why is my progress not so slow? It's like, well, you need to be doing like 10 times as much. And so I think if you can change your environment to facilitate that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I didn't think about that aspect. I've heard arguments around, neuroplasticity and how as you're young, you're obviously going to just be able to absorb more information than you are as adults. But you're right. Like kids, you're just going to also the big things about language learning is that it's not like learning tennis or basketball where you can practice and make mistakes and you don't have to worry about being judged or feeling nervous or embarrassed. But learning a language or speaking a language, you're actually forced to speak with someone. You're kind of putting yourself out there. You're getting rejected if someone is kind of judging you based on how you're speaking.
Yeah.
And kids they don't give an F, right? They're just going to be speaking, crying, laughing, whatever it might be. It makes me think about like why some people think they get more fluent when they get drunk, or if they have a couple of drinks for the cocktail. And I don't know if that's true or if it's just they don't really care about what other people are thinking when they're speaking.
Yeah, I think there's two things. So one is that that you're less anxious when you're intoxicated. So that is a factor, right? Like if you're drinking, then a famous effect of alcohol is that it's liquid courage, right? Like that you have less activity of the sort of threat centers in your head. And so when you have less anxiety, you're going to be more fluent. And the second thing is I think also it has an inhibitory quality. So a lot of what you're doing when you're speaking a language is that you're also using a kind of top-down executive processing of like, this is the right word and I got to conjugate this right and this kind of thing. And sometimes that can be helpful. It can help you avoid mistakes, but sometimes it can also be counterproductive. It's a little like it can cause you to kind of choke and stumble over things. Whereas if you are drunk, maybe you're going to make mistakes, but you're going to do it more fluidly because you have less inhibition. But I wouldn't recommend getting drunk all the time as a good way of learning a language, because it probably also is bad for memory consolidation and some other things. I think you're probably better off, again, with a lot of exposure, if you're sort of like, okay, for the next 30 days, I'm only going to speak in Portuguese when I'm out of the house, let's say, as an example. By about day 10, it just feels you have those benefits of like low anxiety and low inhibition when you're speaking, but you're also not intoxicated, so you can be smarter and stuff too. So that's a good strategy for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like drinking to be able to be a better language speaker is like taking steroids as like an Olympic runner or something like that. Like you might win one night or one day, you might win a race, but for the rest of your life, you're gonna suffer from that decision that you made,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I do think though that like because of the social atmosphere of language learning, I do find like sometimes the people who are a little bit more extroverted, they're a little bit less bookish. They're more like, oh, I'm going to go to the party and just hang out with people and be unconcerned. They may even learn at an earlier stage. They may even learn the language faster because, the person who's at home who's studying the conjugation, but is like a real inhibition with practicing, isn't going to overcome that early fluency. I mean, later on when you're like, once you get to a certain point, that kind of has diminishing returns and you have to like start listening and reading books because you want to have more college educated vocabulary. Then maybe getting into that, bookishness is maybe more helpful. But we're just talking about, being in another country and being able to interact with people. I definitely think that the speaking a lot is the major reason that people aren't able to do it.
Yeah, the other thing about learning new skills, particularly with languages, I found is this like Dunning-Kruger effect around where you have this beginner joy, misinformed joy, where you're feeling the top of the mountain. You think you're going to be able to be fluent in, or learn this instrument in a couple of weeks. And then reality hits, right? You're like, oh, this is definitely not, there's so much more to learn because you don't know that you didn't know about all these things. So there's this great graph that talks about the confidence gap of an expert between ignorant beginner to informed expert as time goes on.
Yeah.
How do we overcome these plateaus and realities of low motivation that happens once you've hit this beginner's plateau and allow people to sustain their learning when they become demotivated?
So, I mean, the Dunning-Kruger effect, it's a really interesting paper. I mean, it gets talked about a lot, but a lot of people haven't actually read it. So there's a weird kind of Dunning-Kruger about Dunning-Kruger effects. But one of the things that I thought was interesting, because Dale Kruger, he actually wrote a whole book called Self-Insight. It's a good one about our ability to make knowledge about ourselves. And one of the things when you're learning a skill is that when you are bad at the skill, you're also bad at assessing the skill too. And so I think in the study they did, if I'm correct, it was like a kind of like doing like logic puzzles or something. Like it was a very it was a skill where the ability to know whether you got the right answer is really correlated with being able to get the right answer too. And so people who scored really badly didn't realize they did so badly, also because they lack the ability to assess themselves. And Kruger is he's got a whole body of work about like all the ways that we are bad at assessing ourselves. And he tends to have a cognitive explanation for that like, the skill of assessing oneself is often correlated or related to the skill of being able to do the thing. And so when you're in the beginning, you're bad at it, but you're also bad at really judging like the really fine-grained distinctions of the skill. And language learning is certainly one of those things. I feel like when you start having conversations, you're like, yeah, I've got it. I'm doing really well. But it's also because you can't tell when you're making mistakes, and you can't really tell big differences in speaking ability. But I mean, if you think about your native language, you can definitely tell people who are like non-native, even though they are extremely good, like they almost never make mistakes. You're like, oh yeah, you made that mistake right there. I mean, because you have such a refined internal model of the language. So I think this what you call the beginner plateau, I'd almost call it like kind of the intermediate plateau, that like there's the beginning phase where just doing it at all is so hard, and you're like, oh my god, I finally am standing up on the surfboard, or I finally published my first essay, or this kind of thing. But then there is a transition, I think you're right, where we get kind of stuck in skills. And I think that can happen for a few reasons. One, and to go with the language example, which is really clear, is that the amount that you need to know goes up kind of exponentially. So you have this sort of diminishing returns in terms of performance. So to use an example of language learning, the distribution of words follows this Zipf's laws, this really, really nice law. But it's basically the most frequent words are quite common, and they make up a huge percentage of the language, and then it really steeply drops off. And so in order to get to a really high level of proficiency, and let's assume that like to learn a word, you maybe need to see it in like a dozen contexts. Well, to see the word the in English, you could just read one paragraph and you've gotten a dozen exposures. I mean, that's probably not enough to learn what the definite article means, but you're getting quite a bit of exposure. But to learn like, an obscure word just through exposure requires you reading like hundreds of books in order to actually encounter that word enough times to be confidently sure of what it means. And so this just means that to go from like I understand 99% of the words to understanding 99.9% of the words can be like a tenfold increase in the amount of work you have to do. And that's just sort of unavoidable. That's just kind of how skills are. I think that's one reason why it's actually for people who are you're not planning on publishing books in that language, it actually makes sense to be kind of like learn badly some languages, because you can actually get to that level where you can have a conversation much, much easier than you can get to a level where you can, deliver a college lecture and not make any mistakes. Like it is actually that much easier.
Yeah.
The second reason, though, and I think this is particularly important with a lot of skills that we do repeatedly, is that when you continue to practice a skill, you make it more and more effortless and more automatic. But that also can mean that if there's a better way of doing things, it's harder to do. So when I think about, a good example of this is if you're typing on a keyboard. If you learn to like hunt and peck with your fingers and you keep doing that, you'll become smoother, more efficient. You'll do it faster and faster and faster. But you're never going to suddenly switch to touch typing. Like that requires conscious effort. It doesn't require this is never going to just turn into this spontaneously. And because of that, touch typing, where you have all your hands on the home row and you use each finger to do it, is going to be in the end much faster than hunting and pecking. And so if you do lots and lots of practice, you can get this sort of plateau, because as you keep doing the skill, in some ways you make it harder for yourself to learn the better method. You make it harder to upgrade it. And while, I can tell you, okay, learn touch typing from the beginning and then all your problems are solved, and that's a reason why you want to learn these best practices from the get-go. For many skills, it's just inevitable that you're going to have ways of doing things that are not perfectly optimal. And so getting better requires this deliberate practice. It requires making things deliberate again so that you can be like, oh no, I'm going to touch type instead of hunting and peck. And so this intermediate plateau is often because, the real work you need to do to improve, it can be difficult. It can be strenuous. It's not always automatic. And so I think that's another reason why we could get stuck in this sort of middle layer, because we keep doing it and you don't get much better because you're kind of stuck at this sort of, I don't want to say bad habits, but this sort of way of doing things, which is maybe not perfect.
Yeah, it makes me think about my friend who's here learning Portuguese, and when he first started to learn, he got the basics a little bit because he spoke Spanish, but he does like coaching, and he talks a lot about like more deeper spirituality and kind of goes deep in with people. He doesn't do it a lot of small talks, right? So he basically asked his tutor to teach him all of the conversations that he would have as a coach, which is like very deep, emotional, vulnerable things in Portuguese. But he didn't learn any of the basics. So he would be able to go and have a conversation with you for like 30 minutes around the meaning of life and what your purpose is in life, and talking about your vision board. And then you would ask him like, what do you want to eat? And he wouldn't understand any of it. And I'm like, it's kind of smart because he learned it in a month or so, just cut through all of the BS and was able to get to his goal, but he missed out all the foundations. And I'm wondering if there's some validity to that, like whether it's, let's say learning piano and you just want to learn how to play Coldplay, but you don't really learn much of the foundation, but you can play Coldplay like extremely well because that was your ultimate goal. Is there some validity to that, or is that actually going to hurt us in the end?
I mean, it's interesting. Like I don't think these have definite answers. It kind of depends on your goals and your situation. I think the broader and deeper you want your skill to eventually become, the more it makes sense to pay attention to that foundation. So if I were like, I don't want to just become someone who can program this one quick thing, but I want to be like one of the best programmers in the world, then I think going to school and spending 4 years studying computer science and learning all these abstract theories, even though you can't code anything, is maybe productive for you, just because you're giving yourself mental tools that you're not going to acquire just accidentally, and it's going to inform your practice in a lot of ways. On the other hand, if I was just like, well, I want to get a job as a web programmer right now, I would be like, okay, you want to do crash course for web programming. You don't really need to like spend 6 months learning like the theory behind programming language design or something like that. And so I think these differences in goals, difference in the students, different in the motivation is going to change how you want to approach things. For language learning, I think if you were talking about basics and stuff, I feel like I tend to feel like languages are a little bit more flat, meaning that there's not a lot of hierarchy. Like you need to know like words and some grammar and stuff, but it's not like, oh, well, I didn't learn this conjugation exercise, so I'm not going to be able to understand, this conversation someone's having later. Like a lot of what learning a language is learning a lot of specifics, learning, like you said, the words and vocabulary that are associated with having these philosophical discussions is not the same as ordering from a restaurant. But neither is ordering from a restaurant. Like they're all different. And so to be fluent in lots of situations, you just kind of have to learn all the different situations. And there's really no way of avoiding that. And that contrasts with a subject like math, for instance, whereas like if you didn't learn algebra really well and then you're in the like calculus class, like you're just done. Like you can't do it, right? Because it builds on top of that other thing. So I tend to think there's a difference between subjects which are kind of deep in a way and ones that are broad. And for piano, I'm not sure where it lies, but I would suspect that kind of like the keyboard example, that unless you were really like, I just want to be able to play it for this one party and I want to do it after, you want to get the right techniques from the beginning. Not necessarily all the music theory and stuff, but at least the right physical techniques, just because you're going to have the same keyboard problem that like if you learn to hunt and peck, it's just not going to be as fast as the right method, even if the right method takes longer to learn. And so with the piano, I would probably, again, if I didn't want to just play like one song, I would probably like, okay, what's the technique? Just because that's going to be really hard to correct later. But the question about like, music theory and some of these other things, I think it will depend. Like, I mean, there's definitely people who they know certain kinds of music and they can't do other kinds of performances and they're okay with that. And I think that's fine when you're deciding what you want to pursue out of a skill.
Yeah, I played piano for 8 years and I learned the theories from like the ground up, all of the notes, all the theories, all of the things. And I have a language learning app that I run, so I get a ton of other education app ads that are out there, and particularly a lot with like playing guitar or piano. And it amazes me how they teach you how to play piano. And it kind of is like mimicking in a lot of ways. Like if you, it kind of hook you in learning how to play Coldplay or Celine Dion, and it's all about visuals. And they're just teaching you how to follow the keynotes based on what color you see on the screen. I don't know how effective that is, honestly. It's interesting just because I come from a different background.
I gotta be honest with you. I mean, if I can be an old man right now and gripe about the state
Let's
of
do it. Yes.
these days, I feel like a lot of ed tech is bad. Like a lot of the stuff like that's popular, I'm like I like a lot of the stuff you see is bad. And the reason why, and I think it's not just a coincidence why it's bad, but I think fundamentally what we want in learning does not always line up with what's good for us in learning. So I talk about this, but there's this whole literature about like where students make choices of how they want to learn something, and that doesn't line up with what is actually more effective. Like you do the study and then it doesn't work as well. And so I think that's one reason why I write these books, because I want people to know what actually works. But also I think it just reflects some of our own tendencies. So one of the examples I thought was really interesting is that there's this whole literature called aptitude treatment interactions, which is basically, I'm going to get you to do this with learning. And does that help you with learning? And sometimes it depends on how much you already know or how skilled you are. So for instance, students that have lower ability or worse background knowledge, so less experience with the subject, tend to benefit from more structured lessons. So it'd be like, this is the template, this is how you do this, and then you follow the exercises exactly. And higher ability students or students with more background knowledge tend to benefit from more exploratory, open problem solving. So like, I'll give you an ambiguous situation, like try to apply it. And the reason why is that, if you don't have a lot of knowledge, the working memory load is really low. So there's a theoretical explanation for why that's the case. What's interesting, though, is if you ask students how much they like different learning methods, they like the opposite. Like they like the one that works worse for them. So low ability students like the really open exploratory things, and high ability students like the structured ones, even though like they actually learn worse from those techniques. And so this seems kind of perverse. Like, why would we like the thing that works us well? But my explanation for it is that the brain's kind of an effort-saving machine. Like that's what we're designed to do, is like, you find something that works, and then you're trying to expend as little effort as possible on it. And learning is often effortful. So the thing that actually works better often engages you more. It requires more mental bandwidth. It requires you to think harder. And that often rubs against the sort of tendency was going there. So like the low ability students like the free environment because there's nothing forcing them to use the correct technique. So they can just do whatever they want, even if it doesn't work very well. And the better students like the structure because they don't have to actively remember what the method was. They have it in front of them. It's less effort for them to follow the sort of cookie cutter formula. And so I think of that in terms of like, you know, a lot of apps that are for educational purposes, well, they're designed to be like games, and most of the incentive is to make them fun and palatable for the user. And they're, you know, they're driven by the student who's not really paying attention to their learning rate and whether or not they're getting that much better at it. And because of that, you know, the incentive is to design these things so that they're fun and easy and not that they're teaching you the real skills. So I do think that, like, yeah, to be the stodgy kind of old, you know, naysayer here, I do think that there is a real sense in which like the old school teachers who, you know, they've seen a lot of students, they know what they need to learn, they know what the standard is, they know, they're often in a better position to say what's going to work just because they have this picture of the skill. Whereas the student who doesn't have a picture of the skill, they've got the Dunning-Kruger problem. They don't know what the skill actually looks like. And then they play a game that's sort of like thematically similar to what the skill is. They're, you know, oh, this is fun. And then there's never really this sort of, but is it actually working? Am I actually getting better at this check at the end? So I do think that's a problem with a lot of ed tech is that, you know, some of it can be bad. And I think it can be bad for a very fundamental reason.
Yeah, I totally agree. By the way, I'm in the industry, and it's completely incentive. If you look at any of the biggest players, it's generally gamified without needing a high effort stake. Duolingo is a great example, right? Biggest language learning app in the world. Don't know any people that's really gotten fluent at speaking using the app.
I hate it. I mean, it's kind of sad for me. Like Duolingo is doing some stuff right. I don't want to be like overly pessimistic about it, but it's very clear what their economic incentives are is to have people use the app and not to produce fluent learners. And it's, you know, it's unfortunate. Like I don't want to name names, but I know people in my life that use Duolingo. I know people I've met that use Duolingo, and they're like, I've been doing it for 7 months, and it's like maybe a language that I know a little bit, and you know, it's like, oh, well, can you like speak a little bit? And they're like, oh no, and you're sort of like, but why are you doing
I'm busy
it?
Right
then?
now,
You know?
yeah.
So I'm sorry, but you know, like, and again, I think. For some people, that's fine. They weren't going to do anything harder than Duolingo. And so it really is just a language themed game for them. But I think that kind of dissonance between sort of a sophisticated understanding of how learning works and what is in the marketplace is often missing. And I think it does lead people to make kind of bad decisions because they do get super excited about learning something, and then they pick something that just, oh, well, I think I like this, but they're not really sure what works, and then they end up doing something that doesn't work as well for them. So I think that's a good reason why it's helpful to sort of understand a bit about how learning works, just because our brains are riddled with all these biases and cognitive illusions about what is effective.
Yeah, this brings me to something I've been curious about is how do we know what type of learning methods are the most effective for us? So for example, like there are some people that are avid audiobook listeners, and they'll listen to every audiobook in 1.4, 1.5x speed, and that's the only way they consume knowledge because it is much more efficient. But there's times where I would listen to an audiobook and I would have no idea what I just listened to for the last 2 hours, particularly like a complex topic. And sometimes reading for me is just more effective. And then there's visual learners, kinesthetic, all these different things. Is there certain methods that are just tried and true that we should all be looking for, or is it all really personalized? And if so, how do we figure out what is the best method for us?
So again, to continue my old stodgy,
we're going old school. Okay.
persona that I've developed right now that we're leaning into it.
We got to put a great beard on you.
This is another. Okay. So learning styles. You brought it up. So now I get to have my little ranting spot. So learning styles is a really common thing. It's a really popular meme. Like I'm a visual learner, I'm an auditory learner, I'm, kinesthetic learner, or what have you. The research behind it is so bad. Like it's not true. Like people are not kinesthetic or visual or auditory learners. There's been lots of research done on it. Pretty much all these kind of like horoscope personality distinction, learning distinction things, most of them don't hold water. So it's not the case that like, well, I learn this way and you learn that way and this kind of thing. No, we mostly all learn the same way. I'm sorry. Like it's not true. Some people learn better than others. And some people have a greater like visual working memory, so they're better at some visual tasks than other people. Some people have a better auditory working memory. But if you give them a lesson and you say, okay, I'm going to give this lesson as the audio or as the text to the different group of learners, you can't find that effect. You can't find the effect that like the auditory ones benefit for things in their preferred modality. And there's even some perverse effects that like teachers who sometimes believe in these learning style theories will deliberately, like the kinesthetic learners, which is often like the code word for the less academic kids, they often do things in a way that like deprives those kids of good educational opportunities. So I'm not a big learning theories fan, but what I will say when you're talking about audiobooks, I think that's important. I tend to think that people do have different abilities that will bias them in favor of certain things. So for instance, if you are a worse reader, you may find that you read more slowly. And so audiobooks are kind of like relatively more efficient, right? Because listening is a different ability than reading. They both result in words in your head, but like reading, you have to decode the words and do this kind of stuff. So like I tend to be someone who's on the end of like reading is more efficient than audiobooks. But what you talked about like listening to an audiobook and not retaining stuff, I mean, my big point is that people often do other things when they're listening to audiobooks, which can be a convenience, but it also means that you're paying less attention in the material, which definitely means you're going to learn less than if you're sitting and reading it. So I think, again, these sort of ideas about ourselves and how we learn, I think are very important, and they're consequential because you will have people that will say these things like, they're very committed to, again, learning styles theory, which I recommend not following me on this. If you are interested in learning styles theory, go to Daniel Willingham. He's a Harvard educated cognitive psychologist who has done a very big write-up about like all the research on there. So this is not just me. This is not just like some random internet guy saying this, but I think it's very important to understand these ideas, because it's very easy to go down a rabbit hole where you're like, oh yeah, this is the thing that works, and it's just it doesn't.
Fascinating. Okay, so another myth debunked, Scott, by the old school methods guy. Okay, so interesting. So there is no personal learning theories that we're better at or anything like that. Okay, so what are the most effective ways to learn? Let's take the example of audio versus reading.
I tend to think that there's not a huge difference. So if you were to like put yourself in a room where you're listening to something or you're reading something, and like how much do you retain, I don't think it would be that different if you're like paying an equal amount of attention and that kind of thing. Reading has some advantages that it's non-linear, so you can go back when you miss something. It's easier to take notes. You can, like you can dog ear a page. You can't do that in an audiobook as easily. But I think the practical consequences tend to outweigh the physical ones. But I mean, also, like if we're talking about, I'm assuming that your ability to listen and read the language are equally good. That may not be the case. Like if I think about foreign languages, I mean, if we're talking about a language, like if I'm reading in French, for instance, my reading in French is going to be much better than my listening in French, because the French like words, it's much easier. They're often very similar to English. The pronunciation is going to be faster. I'm going to pick up more when I'm reading than when I'm listening. If I were doing it with Mandarin Chinese, it would probably be the opposite, because the characters are so complicated. My ability to read the characters is not zero, but it's worse than my ability to listen in some cases. And so I mean, you have to factor those things in, but those are kind of like ordinary reasons. It's not because I'm, I have some particular auditory or visual disposition. And so I think what is the best method to learn? I think it really depends on the situation, but I think some of the major factors, and I talk about in the book, some of the major factors that matter is, again, you want to have good examples. You want to get sort of hone in on the right method. You want to have lots of practice. You want to have feedback. These are things that are universal. And there's lots of little details, which is why I wrote a whole book about it. But I mean, those are things that tend to be fairly universal. So it's not that I just don't think it's the case that there's completely different ways that are just equal. Sometimes one's more convenient for you. If you listen to the audiobook during your commute, but you can't read a book. I mean, yeah, maybe reading audiobook is good, but that's not really a deep cognitive explanation. It's just like the ordinary practical one.
Interesting. So as long as you're paying attention, reading and audio, there's no distinct differences. You just have to pick whichever one is your preference.
Yeah, I mean, I have heard that that there's been some studies that show like print books are maybe a little bit better than ebooks, but some of that is also done on like if you're doing like iPads or something, there's like more distraction, and there's like small effects. I have a post on my website if people are interested where I there's some research that compares audiobook, print, and ebooks. But I would say like the major takeaway is that probably at the level that you're going to care about the practical takeaways, like the sort of like from an obvious point of you consuming them is gonna matter more. Like for instance, when I'm writing a book and I'm doing research, I much prefer a physical book than an audio book, because audiobook's really hard to like reference later.
Yeah,
but
right.
I mean, that's not some deep explanation. That's just something you're going to learn from doing it. And similar to like my commute example, I mean, I like to listen to audiobooks during my commute, and it's harder for me to read them because maybe I'm walking around and stuff, right? So so those are good practical considerations for learning.
Going back to the methods, talk to me about the Feynman technique. Who was Richard Feynman, first off, for people that aren't familiar? And can you explain what the Feynman technique is that you wrote in the book, and why that's applicable for people that are learning things?
Right. So Richard Feynman, he's a Nobel Prize winning physicist. And in particular, he was someone who I think had a real knack for explaining things. I mean, you can go online and listen to him explain stuff on YouTube. But like for someone who, he won a Nobel Prize for quantum electrodynamics. So like a really esoteric kind of field of physics. But he had this way of talking and explaining things in very simple language that made him quite a popular science communicator as well. And so this Feynman technique was sort of loosely inspired by his biography. I remember I did like kind of the first video where I explained the Feynman technique shortly after reading his biography. And he had a section where he was talking about, I forget exactly what it was. It was like a paper by Yang and Mills that was like some kind of complicated thing. And he just sort of went through it and like kind of line by line, just sort of like read it very closely. And he was able to come up with this explanation. And so the technique that was inspired by him for learning was that if you were trying to understand something, it helps to try to explain it to someone else. So if I'm trying to understand some complicated idea, I can be like understanding X, and then I can sort of write an explanation. And the idea I think here is twofold. First is that by trying to explain it, suddenly you're doing this mental work of trying to put the pieces together yourself. So sometimes when you just read something, you're not actually thinking about it. So writing it down helps with that. But the second thing that I think is even more important is that when you're writing out the explanation, it's much more obvious where the gaps are in your understanding. So like, well, I don't understand on line 32 why the teacher did this, right? And so that allows you to go back to a textbook, go back to a teacher, go back to a peer, and have this sort of feedback to like fill in those gaps, which wouldn't be obvious if you're just like, well, I'm just confused, right? And so the Feynman technique was one of the first sort of learning techniques that I talked about, which became really popular. But I think it's because of that when we're dealing with subjects in school where we feel confused, it can be very difficult to know how to move forward. I mean, if you want to memorize something, you can make flashcards. If you want to like practice a procedural skill, you can just do it a lot with some feedback. But understanding can often be one of these mysterious qualities where you either get it or you don't, and you have no idea what to do if you don't get it. And so I think the Feynman technique helps. Like it's a method that helps fill that gap, because it is a way of taking something like, I don't understand this, and like, can I break that down into some practical steps to understand it?
Got it. Yeah, he's very well talked about. I think Tim Ferriss talks about him a lot as well. I didn't really know too much about him, but I guess to summarize,
Surely You're
teaching.
Joking, Mr. Feynman. Great biography. So anyone wants to hear that book, I really recommend it.
Nice. Yeah, we'll link that below. I guess another fast way to just learn things in general is actually to help you retain more of the information that you're learning. So memory boosting is something that I've been very curious about. And, beyond taking supplements and omega-3 and, lion's mane, all these different things that biohackers are doing these days, what are some practical ways that people can remember names better? People can remember words or vocabulary better to just in their everyday life, even if they're not learning a new skill.
So there's lots of strategies to improve your memory. One is to use mnemonics. Now there's lots of them that are out there. The weakness tends to be that there tend to be for information in fairly specific formats. So like you can memorize lists, but there's mnemonics for almost any category of thing that you would like to memorize. So if you want to memorize people's names, a mnemonic would be like you associate their name with some kind of picture, and then you mentally associate the picture of their face with that picture. So if their name is like Daniel, let's say, you can imagine like Daniel Radcliffe, and like so they're dressed up like Harry Potter. And then I remember, okay, Harry Potter, Daniel Radcliffe, his name is Daniel, right? And so this is a technique that essentially allows you to take two things that are hard to associate and link them through an intervening thing that's much easier to associate. So mnemonics are quite powerful. And these have been, a good book on that, if you're interested in that, is Moonwalking with Einstein. Joshua Forrest talking about memory competition, and it all centers around mnemonics. And so if you get really good at them, you can memorize things that would seem like almost inhumanly possible to memorize. Like people who are good at them can, memorize the order of a deck of cards in 60 seconds or memorize a poem verbatim after reading it once. They're very difficult to do without mnemonics. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is simply retrieval practice. So retrieval practice is practicing remembering something without looking at it. So if someone tells me their name, for instance, I might like try to either explicitly saying their name or try to recall their name at a few points in the conversation. And that is a way of strengthening that mnemonic association. We tend to remember things better when we actively have to use them. And so opportunities for testing yourself. This is why flashcards work, by the way, is because retrieval practice is much more beneficial than simply just looking at the list that you have to memorize. So if you have to memorize vocabulary words, I really recommend things like Anki, which is a way of making lots of flashcards. But it also applies to things like, if you're trying to solve a problem, getting a chance to like try to recall how you solve the problem is very beneficial because of this retrieval practice effect. Other things that I think help with memory, which people don't often think about but are super important, is things like background knowledge. So there was a very interesting study done with students, and they put them in different groups based on their reading ability. So good readers, poor readers, and their reading ability here. They've also done other studies which are like use it as a proxy for intelligence too. So you can also think of like high IQ, lower IQ students. And then they also put them in groups based on their prior knowledge of the thing being discussed. So one of the famous studies used baseball, like it was a description of a baseball game. So there were students who knew lots about baseball and knew little about baseball. And the finding from the study is that the best factor for determining how much you remember from the text, so we're just talking about memory, is how much you already knew about baseball. And this just means that you can retain much more of like the books you read, the classes you take, if you have more background knowledge, because those background knowledge elements form hooks for the new knowledge you have. One of the theories I just touch on briefly in this new book is there's this whole theory of like, how do we comprehend things that we read? And one of the findings from that research is that it's always this union of the text that we're reading and our background knowledge, that if you only had the text, you wouldn't be able to make sense of almost anything. You need a considerable amount of background knowledge to make sense of the text, but then also to remember it. And so a lot of what we're doing when we struggle to, remember things from a book, remember things, is that we're missing the background knowledge. And so it's harder to slot in what we're learning into an existing schema. So in some ways, that's a reason to, be focused on learning and learning a lot, because the more you learn, in some ways, it's a little bit of an exponential growth curve. You have a greater ability to learn as you learn more, especially within a domain.
Right, totally. So I guess it's kind of like language learning. The more languages you've learned in the past, you can apply that knowledge, especially if it's a similar language, like a Romance language, kind of all transfers.
Or even within a language, like other research is that in order to acquire new vocabulary from a text, you probably need to be understanding about like 97% of the words in the text. So if I give you a text which is like 50% new words, you're not going to learn anything new from it. But if you understand like 95 to 97% of the words, then those few that you don't understand, there's enough meaning there that you can just learn those meanings of those new words based on what you already have. So this is like the real bootstrapping problem of language learning, is that if you you only understand about 50%, and then you just go to a lecture and someone's talking at you, you're not really learning that much, because you don't have enough meaning, you don't have enough background knowledge to actually be like, oh, what was that word? Oh, it must probably mean something like this, because I already understood the context of what's being said. So that's very important, I think, whenever you're learning a new ability, is like, do I have enough background knowledge to like profit from this book or profit from this situation that I'm in?
Interesting. Yeah. So going into that, I want to talk a little bit about like skill, like choosing what skill to learn. Because I would place learners into these two buckets, right? The first is probably what we talked about the most, which is already know a skill you want to learn, like Portuguese or piano, or you want to remember better, and you have a goal, and you apply those skills that you have in your book to be able to learn that faster. The second bucket of people are, maybe you just learned a new language and you're done with that, and you're kind of ready to adventure. It's the adventurous learners, right? They're trying to figure out what is the next skill they want to acquire, or the next thing, but it's kind of a blank slate. And I spoke to James Altucher about this, and he has a really interesting way to frame how he decides to learn new skills. And he talks about optionality.
Yeah.
And he decided to become a stand-up comedian after being in business, because he saw that being a stand-up comedian is way more, it creates way more versatility than, let's say, learning how to play ping pong. I don't know if that's a good example. Maybe ping pong will help you in other things, but stand-up comedy allows you to be funnier, allows you to be more confident, allows you to be a better communicator, a better storyteller. And that one skill allows you to do so many other things better, and allows you to transfer that skill into another thing. Maybe like learning Spanish is another one, because it can allow you to learn Portuguese faster. So talk to me a little bit about that, is like, for the people that have this blank slate and they want to just be able to learn a skill faster, and choose a skill that's like effective, how would they go around choosing it? What are some of the skills that you found, like stand-up comedy, that can transfer to many other things?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think the first part, like, to answer the first part of your question, which is like, how do you choose the skills? I tend to view two ways. You can be instrumental or intrinsic. So instrumental is, I have this goal, and then you have to like work backwards. What do I need to learn to achieve the goal? And I think that can be motivating in some cases. Like, if you want to be a successful entrepreneur, maybe there's some things you need to learn, and you use that goal to motivate the learning project. And the intrinsic one is, what are you really excited about? What are you really interested in? I tend to start from that emotional place rather than a real logical analysis, simply because I recognize that like the main deficit for most people is that they're not learning enough. They mostly spend their time doing things they're already good at, or things that are just, not really expanding them intellectually, expanding their skill repertoire. So if that's the default, where you are, you spend your spare time watching Netflix, or you're scrolling on social media, but you're not like learning to paint or cook or do some new skill, then focusing on like, what am I excited enough that I will break through that sort of default to do nothing and actually learn something important. So I think that's very important. From a more logical analysis of like, which skills, if I was this super interested, dedicated learner who's spending all of my free time learning things that are important, what is more important? I do think it depends on kind of where you want to go. So I think what James said, is very true. If you're trying to get good at some communication skills, stand-up probably has some advantages, because, you're right. If you're telling good jokes, that also works in a business setting, and when you're making friends, going on dates. These are all things that's going to play into. But I think, you have to kind of think of like, which domains do I want to be good at, and what are some sort of key parts? Like, I'm thinking if I want to get good intellectually at a lot of like science, social science domains, understanding statistics would be like a really good one, right? Because it's sort of an abstract idea that underlines psychology, economics. Like, so many fields are now driven on this statistics. If I were thinking about like, oh, I want to get good at some sports, for instance, then maybe I would want to be doing some sports that emphasize a large range of movements and lots of different movement types, because that's going to give me more versatility. So maybe something more like, I don't know the best example of this, but like maybe something like a martial art is going to be more beneficial than, a shot putter or something like that. If you're trying to have general athleticism, because it's going to have greater variety and it's going to teach you basic movements that are going to apply to lots of other things. So these are kinds of ways I would think about it. But I feel like in some ways that's putting the cart before the horse, because the starting point has to be like, well, what are you really excited about? And then like the way to do it better kind of follows from that. So I always try to get people to, think about what would be really cool. Like, it would be really cool if I could do this, and focus on that first. And then I think the motivation to learn more things will come after.
Yeah. And I think it's also largely dependent on what skills that you've acquired before choosing. So if you, I don't know, if you've played tennis all your life and your goal is to become like a world-class badminton player or something like that, like it probably transfers through, right, in some ways, because of the motor skills. If you want to learn,
sports probably have quite a bit of similarity.
Right. Versus like trying to be a water polo player, like, maybe you're gonna have a little bit of a tougher time doing that, or going to martial arts or something like that. So yeah, I guess knowing what skill you already have and how it can transfer into the options of skills you want to acquire, if that's your goal, is just to acquire new skills. But yeah, I guess at the end of the day, it's pretty personal.
Yeah, and I mean, you're probably right. There's definitely some skills that are going to be more general than others, and I mean that's a lot of what we're trying to do in our education system, is trying to figure out, well, what is more general. Like, we could definitely teach people like, oh, here's how you do a software job at Microsoft, but we don't usually. We like teach them algebra, because we think algebra is more general than like the specific operating procedures of being a mid-level programmer at Microsoft. That's sort of like, even if that's your end up goal, we think we're going to train you better with algebra. And so I think that is a goal of education, is to try to do this, at least with intellectual subjects. But there's always a lot of debate about like which things are really fundamental, which things are more general than others. And so there's probably some lapses there. I mean, we spend a lot of time teaching some things in school that maybe we don't use that much of, and there's subjects that maybe are really important that we don't do much at all. So I think it's a very interesting thing to like discuss and debate. But I think that's the basic point.
So final topic here for you. I want to talk about the future and how, particularly around AI. Sam Altman, he just went on the podcast called the All In podcast, which is like 4 billionaires talking about future technology and what's happening around the news. You've probably heard of it. And he talked about what he's most excited about in terms of how people can leverage AI into doing incredible things. And one of the things that he said that he's really bullish on is an AI tutor that can help people learn pretty much anything. Now, this is going to be a little bit outdated if people are listening around like the actual models that it's going to allow you to do that. But walk me through this trend of AI and how this could impact learning in general, and what are the actual skills that people need to learn with the advent of AI, and how we can leverage AI to learn new things.
I mean, it's definitely going to have an impact on some things. I know, the most obvious example, and since we were already talking about it, is language learning. I mean, I did my big language learning project 10 years ago, and there's a lot of things, like at that time it was like, well, Google Translate was like finally getting kind of good, and so you could do that. But I mean, now you can do things that are just way beyond what I was doing then. And so there's moves you could make in the studying learning process of learning a language that are certainly AI facilitated. I mean, you can have whole conversations with an AI in another language now. You can You can ask it to like correct your speaking. And now with these, the GTP 4o model that came out, you've got multimodal stuff. So you could probably use it as a pretty decent language tutor. So I expect there's some things that, I haven't fully explored what works and what doesn't, but I expect there to be quite a bit of innovation, especially in the fields where the current crop of large language models really excel. So I think you could probably get quite a bit of advice for those things. I think there's also probably going to be some benefits in using large language models to provide kind of like, it would be nice to have something where like you're reading someone's code and then there's like a little tooltip where it would like explain what this code is doing. You could like highlight it. So there's lots of ways I think that you can get something like a tutor, something that's helping you with learning things. But at the same time, I also feel like as much as things change, they stay the same. And so I really think that the two big mistakes that I think people are making, which I hear as I go on podcasts and I talk to random people, the first mistake is people think that learning is going to be obsolete, that they're not going to have to learn things because the AI is going to do everything for them. I think that's naive and ridiculous. I think that, yes, maybe in some far future, we're going to have true AGI that's so much better than everyone at everything that, we're just like pets and this thing lives in the sky and tells us what to do. But I don't think that's coming anytime soon. I think that, we're going to see incremental improvement. Maybe there's going to be some new tricks. There's going to be some new things that it can do that previously couldn't be done. And those are very exciting. But I don't see like this sort of paradigm shift where, no one's having to learn anything just because of it. And then the second mistake I think people are making is that, well, you're not going to have to understand things or learn things because, again, I can just get the computer to explain it to me on the fly. We were talking about background knowledge and the importance of what's already in your head to be able to acquire new knowledge. That's not going to change. You can't externalize that. So I can ask the computer to explain to me quantum physics like I'm 5 years old, but if I don't have the math in my head, I can't really ever understand it. I can just get this sort of approximate description. And so similarly, like if I don't speak the language myself, yes, I can get a translation from it, but I can't just be like, okay, tell me what this word is, tell me what this word is, tell me what this word is, and get that kind of understanding directly. So I tend to think that this idea that, we're not going to have to learn anymore and this is going to take away all the work is overrated. But I think you're absolutely right that AI affords new opportunities for learning. And, especially in those domains like languages, which it seems to do very, very well, there's probably quite a few ways that you could change up how you're studying or how you're approaching things with the benefit of these tools.
Yeah, I guess we kind of have to accept that learning anything or really anything that we're doing is going to be having an assistant with an AI involved. And I think about that when back in the day when you had to be really good at memorizing numbers because that's the only way we would communicate. There's no Facebook, there's no WhatsApp. It was just like, what's your number? And I got really good at memorizing numbers back in the day. And I think about now, if somebody gave me an 8-digit number, I would still be good, but I would imagine my niece would not be very good at it because she just didn't grow up in an age where you have to memorize a lot of numbers. So with AI, with all of the information and having that at the tip of your finger, what are some skills that we currently have today that you think will probably not be as important, kind of like the whole number thing? And what are the skills that we should focus on improving so that we can thrive in a world of this AI assisted learning?
Well, there's sort of an interesting question there because it's sort of two parts. One of the things is like, what are the things that people are naturally going to get worse at once the AI starts taking over more of that because there's less pressure on people maintaining those skills. But then there's a second question of like whether that's a good thing, like whether that's actually good for us. So, I mean, an example of an earlier era would be the calculator, right? Like now that we have calculators, people are a lot worse at mental math because it used to be I have to calculate a tip, I have to do that in my head, or I'm cashier and I know that I need to give correct change. I have to do that in my head. Whereas now it just tells you it's 2 quarters or whatever. And I think in some ways it's more efficient. Probably we found a more efficient way of doing things because we have calculators. But on the other hand, not having that extensive practice with doing the mental math probably impedes us with some of our mathematical tasks. Like, as I was saying, this background knowledge is so important. So if your mental math is really bad, it is harder to do some things. And maybe that pressure that was sustaining it is, that being gone has maybe made us worse in some ways. So I wonder about the AI being, our programmers going to be like a lot worse at like checking their code, because the AI can just like, they're not going to actually get the syntax right, because they're just, whatever, I'm just going to get it to do sort of this, and then it'll code it up for them. Or, artists not going to really learn about a lot of the basics of, proportion and this kind of thing, because the first draft's going to come from the AI and they're just going to pencil on top of it. It's interesting. I don't know exactly. It's hard to say. I think it's too early to make really firm predictions, but certainly some of that kind of complement and substitution is going to come about.
Yeah. Well, on the other side, one skill that I can see continuing to become more important if you're trying to learn better with an AI assistant is just learning how to ask the right questions and the right prompts. Like, this whole idea of prompt engineering is a whole new industry or job field for working with AI, and just being able to learn how to ask the right questions, because information is not the scarce thing. It's how do you direct this powerful AI machine into giving you the right answer? And it has to start from you. You can't ask, I guess you could ask the AI to ask you the right questions, but you have to ask the question first.
But I mean, it's it's almost like a communication skill, right? Like, that's what we think of when we think of communication skills. Like, I'm having an interface with you right now, and I'm trying to think of like, what's the kind of answer that he's going to want? And you're trying to like, what is the question that's going to unlock so we're doing this to each other, and we're going to learn communication skills with the AI. I'm like, oh, this is how you have to talk to it. So,
true,
so it's kind of funny, but maybe that's going to be a new skill of like, like in the communications department, they're going to have communicating with your large language model is going to be a new course that they teach at university, and best practices for communication with your AI assistant.
Yeah, an AI head of AI communication. Yeah, I could totally see that.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, this has been great, Scott. I want to make sure people check out your new book, Get Better at Anything. Obviously, Ultra Learning is another great book that people should check out. We'll have all those linked down below. Where can people learn more about you and get more info?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, scotthyoung.com, SCOTTHYOUNG.com, and check out the book. I mean, I think the book is pretty much everywhere you get your books. So it's on Amazon, it's on Audible. I think even Spotify now has audiobooks. So listen to it, read it. I think it's I think this new one, Get Better at Anything, is definitely a great resource if you are trying to plan a difficult learning project, you're trying to improve, maybe not sure what you need to do to move forward. I think it'll give you some of those tools.
Awesome. Scott, appreciate you, man.
Thank you so much for having me.